Have you ever noticed that just when you're on the verge of a breakthrough, chaos erupts? Doubts flood your mind, and everything seems to fall apart. You're not imagining it. The enemy attacks you hardest right before a blessing because he knows God's about to do something massive in your life, and he's desperate to derail your destiny. You're praying for a miracle, but suddenly fear grips you, whispering you're not worthy. Ephesians 6:12 says, "Your battle's not against flesh, but spiritual forces plotting your downfall." You're close to a promotion, but conflicts arise at work, testing your patience, because the enemy wants you to stumble before you step into God's favor. As Psalm 23:5 promises a table prepared in the presence of your enemies. You feel a spiritual high, but temptation hits, luring you back to old sins. 1 Peter 5-8 warns the devil prowls like a lion, seeking to devour you at your strongest. You're about to walk into your calling, but relationships fracture, sowing discord, because the enemy knows unity brings strength. As Ecclesiastes 4:12 says, "A threefold cord isn't easily broken." You sense God's moving, but your finances dry up, because the enemy wants you to doubt God's provision, though Philippians 4:19 says he supplies all your needs. You're growing in faith, but lies flood your mind, telling you God's forgotten you. John 8:44 calls the devil the father of lies, attacking your trust in God's promises. You're about to receive a revelation, but distractions pile up, pulling you from prayer, because the enemy fears your intimacy with God. As James 4:8 says, drawing near to him makes the devil flee. You feel peace, but chaos erupts at home, because the enemy targets your family to shake your foundation, though Joshua 24:15 declares your house will serve the Lord. You're stepping into leadership, but slander spreads, tarnishing your name because the enemy wants to discredit you before your influence grows. As 1 Peter 3:16 says, "A clear conscience silences accusers." You're healing from past wounds, but old pain resurfaces, because the enemy wants you bound, though Isaiah 61:1 says Jesus came to set captives free. You're about to testify of God's goodness, but shame creeps in, silencing you, because the enemy hates your witness. As Revelation 12:11 says, "You overcome by the word of your testimony." You're seeking God's will, but confusion clouds your mind, because the enemy wants you off course, though Proverbs 3:5-6 says trust in the Lord directs your path. You're standing on God's word, but circumstances worsen because the enemy wants you to abandon faith. As Hebrews 10:23 says, hold fast to hope without wavering. You're about to forgive, but bitterness resurfaces, because the enemy knows unforgiveness blocks blessings. As Ephesians 4:32 commands forgiving as Christ forgave. You're growing in prayer, but exhaustion hits, draining your zeal, because the enemy fears your intercession. As 1 Thessalonians 5:17 says, pray without ceasing. You're about to step into abundance, but lack intensifies, because the enemy wants you to curse God, though Job 1:21 shows Job worshipped despite loss. You're sensing a shift, but betrayal stings, because the enemy uses people to wound you. As Psalm 55:22 says, cast your burden on the Lord. You're aligning with God's purpose, but self-doubt creeps in, because the enemy wants you to forget your identity, as 1 Peter 2:9 calls you a chosen generation. You're about to experience joy, but depression looms, because the enemy steals your peace. Though John 16:33 says Jesus gives peace in tribulation. You're building your ministry, but obstacles multiply, because the enemy fears your impact. As Matthew 5:16 says, let your light shine. You're about to receive answered prayers, but delays frustrate you, because the enemy wants you to give up, though Daniel 10:12 says God hears from the first day. You're walking in obedience, but temptation intensifies, because the enemy knows your righteousness threatens him. As 1 John 3:8 says, Jesus came to destroy the devil's works. You're about to inherit promises, but fear of failure grips you, because the enemy wants you paralyzed. Though 2 Timothy 1:7 says God gave you power, not fear. You're growing in love, but division sparks, because the enemy hates unity. As 1 Corinthians 13:13 says, love is the greatest. You're about to step into freedom, but addiction pulls you back, because the enemy wants you chained. Though John 8:36 says, whom the Son sets free is free indeed. You're seeking God's face, but worldly lures distract you, because the enemy wants your focus elsewhere. As Matthew 6:33 says, seek first his kingdom. You're about to shine, but insecurity dims your confidence, because the enemy wants you hidden, though Isaiah 62:1 says, arise and shine. You're trusting God's timing, but impatience grows, because the enemy wants you to rush ahead. As Psalm 27:14 says, wait on the Lord. You're about to walk in victory, but spiritual attacks intensify, because the enemy knows your authority. As Luke 10:19 says, you have power over serpents. You're forgiving your enemies, but anger flares, because the enemy wants you bound. Though Matthew 5:44 says love your enemies, you're about to experience revival, but apathy creeps in, because the enemy wants you lukewarm, as Revelation 3:16 warns against being neither hot nor cold. You're standing firm, but isolation hits, because the enemy wants you unsupported, though Hebrews 10:25 says don't forsake gathering together. You're about to receive wisdom, but pride blinds you, because the enemy wants you foolish. As James 1:25 says, God gives wisdom generously. You're pursuing holiness, but compromise tempts you, because the enemy wants you stained. As 1 Peter 1:16 says, be holy as God is holy. You're about to lead others, but criticism wounds you, because the enemy wants you silenced. As Nehemiah 4:1 shows opposition to God's work. You're trusting God's plan, but chaos distracts you, because the enemy wants you derailed. Though Jeremiah 29:11 says God's plans are for hope. You're about to step into peace, but anxiety spikes, because the enemy wants you restless. As Philippians 4:6 says, don't be anxious but pray. You're growing in generosity, but greed tempts you, because the enemy wants you selfish. As Luke 6:38 says, give and it will be given. You're about to experience God's glory, but despair hits, because the enemy wants you hopeless. As 2 Corinthians 4:17 says, trials produce eternal glory. You're standing on truth, but deception clouds you, because the enemy twists reality. As John 17:17 says, God's word is truth. You're about to walk in boldness, but timidity strikes, because the enemy wants you weak. As Joshua 1:09 says, be strong and courageous. You're seeking God's presence, but busyness overwhelms you, because the enemy wants you distant. As Psalm 16:11 says, in his presence is fullness of joy. You're about to reap, but weariness tempts you to quit, because the enemy wants you defeated. As Galatians 6:9 says, don't grow weary. You're standing at the edge of your blessing, and the enemy's attacks are proof you're closer than ever. He's not attacking because you're weak, he's attacking because you're a threat. You're not a victim, you're a warrior, armed with God's power. As Ephesians 6:11 says, put on the full armor of God. So stand firm, pray without ceasing, and trust God's timing, because Romans 8:37 says, you're more than a conqueror. The enemy's attacks are loud, but God's promises are louder. Your blessing is coming, and no scheme of hell can stop it. Choose faith over fear, obedience over compromise, and God over the enemy's lies. The battle is real, but so is your victory. Claim it now and step into the blessing God's prepared for you.